All right, it got quiet, so I'm going to take that as my cue to introduce our guest speaker now, even though it's 2 minutes early, just so we can give Eric as much time as possible because he's the real act here. I'm Nancy Cass. I'm a member of the faculty both at the Berman Institute and here at the School of Public Health. And it is my pleasure to introduce my friend Eric Dishman. Eric comes to his role as director of the All of Us research study, the National Precision Medicine Initiative, enormous study attempting to recruit at least 1 million Americans through many important pieces of his own background. His own training is in social science, and so he understands research, and particularly social science research, deeply. He also, as probably will come up in his own remarks, is a 23-year cancer survivor who, through his own remarkable intelligence and ingenuity and drive, identified solutions through precision medicine and ended up making a life or death difference in his own trajectory. Eric also spent 23 years at Intel and deeply understands data and the ability to get things done. I got to know Eric because I have the pleasure on most days and honor of chairing the National Precision Medicine IRB. And so I've worked a lot with Eric, and I will say what I like the most about Eric is that he has an incredibly positive, getting to yes personality. And so from the IRB side, we, I'm sure, brought a lot of headaches and challenges and demands. And Eric always said, okay, I hear you, we'll figure it out, we're going to get it done. And I think having somebody like that in charge of a study that is so enormous and so complicated and has so many logistical challenges as well as ethical challenges means that our country is being well served. Eric couldn't come before because our government decided to shut down on exactly the day that he was supposed to come. So we're grateful that he could reschedule so quickly. So Eric, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I better get up here and start talking quickly because you never know when the government can shut down. Just like, oh, shut up, you can't speak any longer. So it's a great honor to be here. Nancy is a fabulous chair of our Central IRB. This program has at its core so many new things we have to figure out at a scale that's not been done before. And it's just thorny logistical issues, thorny financial issues, thorny ethical issues. And I learned from her in the IRB. I think they've learned some perspectives from me from my whole life in Silicon Valley and as a social scientist who becomes an executive in Silicon Valley, which is still a very bizarre experience. And I'm just deeply appreciative, and mostly I'm appreciative I've got to spend some time with a small number of students from the Berman Institute this morning, and I miss teaching and I miss students because their wisdom and intelligence and energy is just incredibly powerful for me. So I call this Accelerating Precision Health for All of Us. I know it's called the Precision Medicine Initiative. I begged the Obama administration when I got brought in to be like, hey, can we please change this to Precision Health Initiative? Because it's not about medicine, it's about health. And medicine is part of health, but not the whole story by any stretch. But nonetheless, it is called the Precision Medicine Initiative. So I'm going to give you an overview of the program, but I'm going to start with a little bit about myself. So, Nancy really hit it there. I call myself an entrepreneurial patient for most talks, and people think that that refers to my Silicon Valley life of starting companies as an entrepreneur, and I was like, no. What I meant is, if you're a patient with a complicated thing like cancer and multiple other comorbidities, you better darn well invent your path to health and take entrepreneurial control of it and try lots of different things, or you may not survive. And most of my life is spent advocating for other cancer patients and teaching them how to be proactive and get their own data and what to do with that data and to put together a care team that they need that looks holistically at themselves coming through the healthcare system as opposed to the kind of partitioning and siloing that we too often do in both our teaching and our practice of medicine. So these are some of the people I've studied over the course of my life. I think I've been living with and part of well over 1,500 households for a wide range of studies that we did at Silicon Valley. I'm a user-centered design person. We start empathetically living with and observing and co-inventing solutions with the very people that we're designing for. It's in my blood, it's the only way I know how to do, it's a magical power. Most of the things I've worked on in my life, whether starting a company or a product or a not-for-profit or a program for cancer advocacy, they're like, where'd you come up with all your ideas? And it's like, I listened to the very people who are gonna actually have to use it. It shouldn't be rocket science, but that's my magic power. And these are some of the people who have shared their lives with me over a long period of time. And a lot of my focus has been focused on seniors. I was a caregiver for my grandmother with Alzheimer's at age 16. I saw the impact on all of us, not just the person with Alzheimer's. And I've been determined, and I grew up very close to my grandparents, and I've been determined for a long time to give seniors the dignity and choice to age in place from where they prefer. And if I'm successful, I want to ultimately get rid of hospitals and nursing homes as we know them. And it's not that there's not a place for hospitals, and it's not that there's not even a place for some amount of institutional care. But we leverage those institutions at the wrong time and place for so many people and should only use them as last resort. So a lot of my focus is about hospital at home. This very campus and some of the experts on hospital at home here have worked with me in my previous life at Intel. And these are just some of the passionate areas I have focused on in my research. The other part of this is my own experience as somebody who is here and alive and able to talk to you because of precision health, because of precision medicine. That was me, my first week of chemo in the summer of 1989 at UNC Chapel Hill. I had bought that lovely black-gray sofa with lawn mowing money that I had saved up during high school and programming that I did. I can't believe I ever thought that was attractive. I'll tell you I did a TED talk about this. You're going to go look at it. It has a deeper story. But here's the basics. I started that chemo. It was very nasty, World War I and II mustard gas agents that almost killed me. I was that thin to start with and then lost another 65 pounds from that frame. And that was pre-Zofran, pre-nausea drugs. So, that chemo was a very different experience in those days than it is now. And when I was first diagnosed, they said, you have a rare form of kidney cancer, you have a year to live. I could do a whole hour-long discussion with you about the ethics of giving people numbers, which I think is a horrible thing to do, and I spend most of my life with patients trying to unhinge those numbers that they've been told of how long they're going to live, because if they can't break out of it, it's manifest destiny, and they almost always die on time, according to what they've been prescribed. And if you can break their thinking out of that, then they can. The challenge is, I remember on the first day I was diagnosed, my doctors from Duke, my doctors from Chapel Hill were arguing in front of me about whether I had something that was, I was 19, so they're like, is this kind of a strange form of Wilms tumor, which is something that children mostly get, or is this something that's like a form of renal cell carcinoma, even though it doesn't look like any of the ones that we know of, and they're arguing in front of me, and one wins the argument. I remember one of the lines in there was like, one of the doctors was like, well, don't treat him like a kid, he's 19. And the other guy's like, don't treat him like an old coot, he's 19. Because they're arguing about things. And that was imprecision medicine, right? This is like arguing to get a definitive diagnosis because insurance needs to know it, the patient needs to know it, and we just finally create a label. And I've only, even in the recent years, come to understand the degree to which that label, that changed the cognitive field that everybody was using to see me, was such a mislabeling. And it was a patient who taught me to be a patient advocate at Duke some weeks after I was diagnosed. And we were in the Duke library, and she was looking at studies about my ostensible diagnosis. And she eventually found 2 studies, and at some point she slammed the book. She was an actuary, so I had barely survived statistics in grad school. I became a qualitative researcher. She says, they don't know anything about you. And she says, first of all, I can only find evidence of 2 studies that have ever been done about your disease, and they were both studies of people over 65. And the problem is, I was not the average of those people in those 2 studies, 65 and above, who had happened to have been studied. But nobody gives you that context and nuance. It was just a proclamation of, you have this, and you're going to probably die within a year, right? I didn't accept it. I did accept it at first. I went into a deep depression, and it was only Verna, this patient at Duke, who taught me to be a very different patient, and it is her legacy that I continue to carry on with the patients that I advocate for. But that is sort of the heart of it. I didn't know the phrases precision medicine or anything like that, but it's like, This is the very heart of it, right? We've extrapolated from a limited number of people who may or may not be like us at all, and this is all that we've given doctors in terms of the science and the breakthroughs, is to extrapolate from those averages and then hope they can customize based on their raw skills what's different from the average norms that we have in the literature. And part of the problem is we don't have very many people in that scientific foundation from which to make the claims that we actually have. Not just along age, as in my case, but certainly along race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and the wide range of both physical and psychological and economic exposures that people have in their lives. And this is the heart and the essence of what we're trying to build that data and that scientific base so that we're not in this act of trying to treat people as the average of who we happen to study. Now, this is a young woman from my field work. I miss her greatly. This was in upstate New York. We had gotten permission. I did a 2-year study of families dealing with Alzheimer's. This was at Intel because we thought we might someday build technologies that supported independent living at home. And it was the first day I was going to meet the 6 families I was going to live with over the next 5 months. All on the first day. It was snowing like crazy, and I ran into their mailbox. She lived in public housing, but she had an independent unit, and I ran into their mailbox in this snowstorm and had to show up at the door and be like, "Hi, I'm the researcher, and I need to pay you for your mailbox." It was just like such a great way to start this field work. But when I showed up at this house, Nora, I'm trying to make sure I use their fake names. Both of them have passed. I went to both of their funerals. Nora, on the right, showed up at the front door with her walker, and I thought she was the person with cognitive decline that we had recruited. But then she takes me on into the living room, and here's her mother lying on the sofa there with advanced Alzheimer's. So when we did these studies, we study the entire care experience. If there's a neighbor that's a key part of their care, we go and live with and observe and study them. If they go into a clinical visit in those days, we would get the permission to do it. And when I went in to the clinic to look at particularly how Nora was being treated, on her paper chart were written some various acronyms that I had the clinical staff explain to me, and they said, "Oh, she's a stubborn, non-compliant patient." And I totally broke research protocol after several visits with these clinicians, because she had multiple heart conditions and cardiac disease conditions and was massively over-medicated, and is the caregiver for her mother who's living at home with her in public housing with like no resources whatsoever to do this. And the first thing was for us to go from her public housing to the snowy times of the year in this part of upstate New York. They had no context for that at the hospital whatsoever. And then finally one day I just got so frustrated because they were so frustrated with her that I said, just pull the camera back. Do you realize she is full-time caregiver for her grandmother, for her mother with Alzheimer's who's living on her goddamn sofa? And they're like, what? And I'm like, this is why she's missing appointments. She either can't get it set up for somebody just to come in and watch her mother and take care of this. I was like, just pull the camera back a little bit and have a little bit of context. And as we did that, we ended up co-inventing with Nora. And so don't tell me that you can't train people who don't know anything about science or technology to successfully get to a point where they can co-invent ideas with you, because we did, and she participated in those. And there were a series of technologies that we actually put in place. This was 20 years ago. That were some simple sensor technologies, well before cell phones and things, that would alert her that her mother was actually trying to get up, and then would help her do cardiac management. We had built a telehealth system that allowed her to do most of her visits from home without having to do the 3-bus drive to go somewhere. And so I learned an enormous amount about the power of what you can do if you are patient, and if you translate your lingo and jargon, and actually make them part of the design teams. And that kind of participatory design is something that I'm trying to bring to NIH and the NIH culture, and certainly fundamental. And we are far from the kind of work that I did for the All of Us research program yet in doing that, but we're definitely moving in that direction. And of course it creates all kinds of challenges and discussions around with an IRB, right? Because if you're not used to doing these kinds of things, and there's all kinds of ethical and safety things that can occur, it's a complicated thing to sort out and do. So we ultimately, I would argue, helped give Nora precision medicine. And it's not about genomics, and it's not about anything that was even there. We were using information and context about her, which all clinicians who are good try to do and want to do, but they don't have the time and the sort of factory line frisking that they're forced to do often by insurance and other mechanisms. And so they just have lost the ability a lot of times to sort of create that context that allows them to take those studies of the average of who happen to have been studied and then customize care for an individual. I think we've been doing personalized medicine or precision medicine for a very long time. When we talk about it in the context of today, what we're talking about is trying to create a wealth of information, environmental, both psychological and exposome and so forth, genetic, health history, what's going on economically with the household, the kinds of things that I had to intervene as a person on with their care team and bring that to bear to then customize prevention or a care plan or a treatment strategy for that individual in the context in which they live. So I want to kind of give you an overview of the All of Us research program and really think about these kind of two grounding examples. The mission of our program is to accelerate health research and medical breakthroughs by enabling individualized prevention, treatment, and care for all of us. Not just the people who have happened to live near an academic medical center, not just the people who have been included in traditional canons of science, but all of us. And to do that, my simplistic way of thinking is there's three fundamental strategic objectives that we've got to do over a long period of time. And these are them, and it starts at the top. If we're going to be successful at this enterprise, and I chose these words very carefully and decidedly, we have to nurture relationships with 1 million or more participant partners from all walks of life for decades. If this study is to be successful, we need to understand with rich data sets around these people's lives what is causing, what is the emergence of health or the lack of health, and the complicated multifactorial aspects that really lead one person who seems the same as the other and another person have radically different experiences of health and outcomes as they go forward. So that we have to do first. If we do that, we will deliver one of the largest, richest biomedical data sets ever, and our goal is to make it easy, safe from a protection and privacy perspective, and as free as possible to access for all researchers, period. Now, there will get to be a point where we can't make everything free because people will want to run compute analyses that are so large, but even then we're trying to figure out, okay, can we get philanthropists to donate compute time to researchers? We don't have the budget to magically do all this, but as we think about our design goals over time, we really want to make this as free as possible for all researchers to use. Now, if we build that data set, will they come? And this is our third strategic objective. It's not enough to just build it. Part of our job is to take responsibility for catalyzing this robust ecosystem of very diverse researchers and funders who are hungry to use and support this resource. We don't have the funding from Congress to fund all the science on top of it. It's the other 27 institutes and centers at NIH that need to leverage this resource and put out the calls for everything from disparities research to molecular diagnostics research, and then eventually clinical trials and other things that leverage the cohort for follow-up studies. But it is our responsibility to try to partner with foundations and others and start to collect information that's going to help us develop a plan that says, if we build it, they will come, because we live in a reality of, if there's no funding to use the resource, then it's not going to happen. So this is, for better or worse, the way that I think about, and we actually literally organize ourselves and our investments around those three strategic objectives. I was part of the working group that helped to originally sort of advise us. When I got the invitation to join, I was like, they must have the wrong era of Dishman. I'm not a biologist. I don't even understand whole genome sequencing, even though it saved my life. In my case, when I got a whole genome sequencing, my team worked with it for 4 months and came back and told me that 92% of everything I'd ever been put on was destined never to have worked. And it was a chance encounter with that whole genome sequence for a guy who's knows senators, is wealthy because he worked in Silicon Valley, is unbelievably connected, speaks English, and has money and means. And I barely got access to precision medicine that ultimately saved my life because they guessed from all of my electronic health record data and from all of my new whole genome sequence that the mechanism causing my cancer may be more like pancreatic cancer. And I managed to stay off of dialysis for 2 more months, do that trial, and suddenly they came back and said you're cancer-free for the first time after 23 years and 57 rounds of chemo, immuno, and radiation therapy. Now, I say that with some trepidation because I was lucky. Our science and our practice for most diseases is not that neat. I was incredibly lucky that a team was willing to take 4 months to actually go through this for the first time that they had ever done for a patient. How do we make that normal? Well, part of the way is we've got to figure out how to do research very differently than we have. And so these are values that were inherent in the program from the beginning. Participation in the All of Us research program will be open to interested individuals. How do we make it so that you don't have to live near an academic medical center to either call a 1-800 number or click here on an app or go to the web and say, I want to be part of this, and actually start to recruit thyself into it. Now, we only have the money for 1 million people. If we get 5 million people that want to do it, we'll have to figure out strategies that say, look, my gosh, that's a much larger resource than we have. And when we reach out to philanthropists, will we reach back to Congress and say, hey, you could have 2 million, you bet. But at the same time, it's like we don't want the criteria to be, you happen to hear about this or know about this when you came in for your clinic visit. It needs to be a much broader audience. The program will reflect the rich diversity of America. I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail in what we call UBR, those underrepresented in biomedical research. Participants will be partners in the program. We started out pretty weak on this. We're getting better. It changes the power dynamic when you actually start putting real participants. We had proxies for participants and listening sessions all around the country, but when you haven't started, you don't actually have actual participants from your program. We're in a beta phase now and have over 25,000 people that are about 70% underrepresented in biomedical research who have joined to help invent the systems, but they're doing the real protocol. And the challenge is, how do we learn from them to scale up the program to the whole country? But even now, we're starting to have enough real participants. In fact, we just opened up the nominations to the participants of like 45 more people to come in and join our executive committee, our advisory panel, the different kinds of committees. And to be clear, some of the scientists are really worried about it. I've done this before, and I'm really worried about it, because it is incredibly disruptive to start to translate. It is not dumbed down, it is a matter of translation. And it will change the dynamic, and I can't wait for it, because it's going to change, and eventually it will become magic. Once we learn how to truly interact with the participants from all walks of life, and they're part of our governance and part of our co-invention, it will be the magic that has delivered every single time I've ever working on a project using these kinds of methods. They will have access to information about themselves. Trust will be earned through robust engagement and full transparency. They'll have access to information and data about themselves. I had a good discussion with students today about the challenge of us doing responsible return of results. We're not just putting data out there and saying good luck. We have to develop genetic counseling capabilities and others that give people support to help contextualize the data that's being given back to them. The data from the program will be broadly available, so we want a diversity of researchers, just like we want a diversity of people participating as participants in the study. We created a set of privacy and trust principles that have helped to guide us with input from multiple agencies and stakeholders. And then this last bit is about being an innovative research program to try to really push for new kinds of policies that hopefully NIH will then spread out to all. Not the least of which is starting out with the central IRB, which is still pretty new to most of our PIs who are in that. And even today they'll be like, but we need to share that with our local IRB. And it's like, no. You have consented and you have signed away that it is our central IRB that is going to set these policies across this consortium of 1,000 people and over 100 organizations who are part of it now. So I'm just going to give you the gist of our approach and the protocol. So I've already talked about this. We need to deliver a rich longitudinal resource, right? So 1 million or more participants who are consented and engaged to provide data in an ongoing way. We're planning for the first 10 years because we can see a line of sight thanks to the 21st Century Cures Bill for our budget for the first 10 years. But like Framingham and like many of these others, we're assuming success and we're assuming continued funding, and we will fight for it because it is that longitudinal aspect that we actually need to really drive the kinds of scientific and accelerate the kinds of breakthroughs we want to do. Reflecting a broad diversity of participants, and that means along age, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and geographies. I mean, this is back to what are the different environments that people live in and what have they been exposed to. And then lastly, again, a diversity of researchers. Like, I don't want just the tier 1 places who already have a computer science program partnered with a bioethics partner and partnered with a medical school. It's like, how can community colleges, how can the brain power from those participate in biomedical research? What do we have to build and do to enable a whole lot more players who don't have all those resources at their disposal to be able to do that? And here's the gist of it. So if you think about a group of people, this million people, with a mix of demographics and geography and health status, we don't want 500,000 people with cancer. We want a lot of healthy people, but a lot of diversity of health status so we can see the emergence of different things over time. And then a lot of different environments, and that means both economic and social environments as well as physical environments. We built these 3 networks, what we call DV, or direct volunteer, partners who can enable that 1-800 experience that I talked about before. But at the same time, get close to where people are to do their biospecimen capture, their blood and their urine samples, as opposed to having to travel a long distance or be part of to an academic medical center to do it. We're not anti-academic medical center, we have a bunch of them who are part of this health provider organization network. So they're recruiting from people coming in and so forth in a more traditional way. And then the third piece of this is a network of community partners around the country who a lot of them have, almost out of the 18 we funded, I think 16 of them have a national reach. And they can help put people locally on the ground to help create awareness and education. So if somebody's coming from the middle of the country where we don't have a health provider organization nearby, then that partner can help with education and help with continuity experience for them as they go through. And then, this is sort of version 1, and you can see the whole protocol online, but it's they enroll and consent, and that includes consenting to share their EHR data. And I think we're doing a good job, and we'll do a better job over time. The dilemma, I talked about this with the students this morning, is we really are taking informativeness seriously, but then a lot of the feedback from people is, man, your consent process takes a long time. But it's we want people to understand that, don't just sign that you're going to share your EHR data. Let's understand what might be in your EHR and the consequences of that. And so we're trying to get to the right point where you can go through it quickly, but there's a lot of places that you could branch off and see an interactive video or others to really understand what we're talking about here. So that's the gist. One of the strategies of this, and you can see a theme in my own life, right? How do we shift care to the home and community? How do we shift research capacity to the home and the community so more people can participate? This is an approximate diagram of a lot of the major academic medical centers around the country. They're part of our network. They're definitely key to our strategy to execute this. But what about all the white space where there's a lot of other people? So we're going to learn through piloting and then how to scale to meet people where they are. This is a design principle for the group. How do we meet people where they are? And that is geographically. In other words, how do we put research capacity into their community where they can go local? Cognitively, economically, educationally. Right now, we're aiming for all of our materials to be at a 5th grade reading level. We're there with most of it. And how do we continue to push that down? So a lot of our initial surveys, for example, come from NHANES. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, we're trying to leverage stuff that's out there. But we've had to go through the extra steps of trying to make that more understandable for people with lower literacy and test that and then obviously translate it into Spanish. That's our initial language. And it's taken us a long time to learn how to do translation the right way and develop that process. But we're making progress towards that. So think of that as a design principle over time. It's what can we do to sort of bring the research capacity to where they are? These are the major building blocks in place today. We're sort of 19 months old as a program. We came together for the first time as a consortium and broke bread together on July 6th in 2016. This Data and Research Center, and the award is with Vanderbilt and Verily Google and the Broad Institute. They're all about the data capture, the data protection, the cleaning and curation of that data, and they're building the researcher portal and tools that will allow people to access to this. We're launching the whole program soon in spring, but this won't launch until much later, at least 6 to 12 months afterwards, because first of all, you want to have enough data in there and have tested your systems, but most importantly, we don't want to start giving data to researchers till we're making progress giving the data back to the participants themselves. So that will come afterwards. The biobank is one of the largest in the world and will probably become the largest in the world. It's at the Mayo Clinic. Just for the version 1 protocol, we're planning for 35 million vials with backup sites around the country. God forbid a major storm sort of wipe out that resource you've gone to so much trouble to create. The Participant Center is building out this direct volunteer network that I will talk about in a moment. So that award went to the Scripps Institute and Eric Topol's team, for those of you that know him in La Jolla. The Participant Technology System, this is the engineering firm that's building all the web and phone and support center-based tools for interacting with participants themselves. This network of healthcare provider organizations I mentioned, now some of them are huge, like the VA, But we're also building a network of federally qualified health centers, many of whom have never been involved in a research study themselves, but they live on the front lines of diverse communities every single day, and they're a key part of our diversity strategy. We've got 6 right now, and over time we'll build up that network as those 6 have learned how to do this and then scale this to a larger network. And then communications and engagement is last, but certainly not least, in terms of bringing together firms and academic organizations who can help us with the communications and marketing and design expertise, but also have a network of community partners who are carrying that communication to their local communities. And many of those community partners, even from the earliest days of the working group sessions, we were doing listening sessions around the country, are helping us know how do you talk to people about who don't even understand what research is? How are we going to talk to communities that have been harmed by Tuskegee and it's still in their mind and in their soul, and how are we going to build that trust, right? How are we going to work with tribal nations to really include them in this? And there's no, when you work with one tribal nation, you work with one tribal nation. What one believes is the right ethical approach may not apply to the others. We just had one of our forums with, we have about 30 tribal leaders who help inform what we're doing this past week. So this is a busy slide that shows these networks. The one I want to point out to you most is this top one. So when I talk about the direct volunteer network, the partners that have been brought together are some big partners. You'll probably recognize Quest Diagnostics. You'll probably recognize Walgreens. You'll probably recognize Blue Cross Blue Shield. These are partners with a presence around the country, and it's like over time we can build the capacity so it's like, oh, the Walgreens near you that's closest to you is the one that can do the blood and urine samples. You don't have to go anywhere else. And through these partners, EMSI is one of the largest up here. Most people don't know what it is. They do in-home physicals for almost every insurer, so they can literally reach every zip code in the country for an in-home physical evaluation and blood draw and urine specimen and other capabilities as well. Now we can't, I mean, I wish I could. I wish I could afford and had enough money from the federal government to say, we'll just come to your home for all 1 million people. We're going to reserve that for people who are living in an area where it's unsafe for them to get research or have particular mobility challenges. But with these kinds of partners in place, you can start to see, we don't have the funding to turn all the lights on everywhere across the country at the same time. But as we start to see a bunch of people who have signed up through 1-800 number or via the digital means of this part of the country where we don't happen to have a community partner or we don't happen to have an HPO, we can bring up capacity for 5 or 6 months and say, okay, you've done everything else, but now you can do your blood draw and your urine sample, and we'll be here for 4 or 5 months in a campaign, close it back down, and then bring that back up when we're ready to do version 2 or other follow-ups over time. We're going to probably fail at this at the beginning, but it's like the potential of what we have here, you can see how game-changing it would be. You're not so geographically dependent on a large urban area. I mean, as Eljong and I, God bless her, she drove this morning, drove through urban Baltimore in the midst of traffic. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to put anybody through that hell just to go get their blood draw and their urine sample for what we're doing here. And then these are the community partners that we have on board. There's many, many others that we're working with in much smaller ways. But these community partners, some of them are providers, because one of our tasks is, how do we get the primary care docs around the country whose own understanding of precision medicine and things like genetics will be really limited? How do we get them to be aware of this and hopefully be excited about the program? But also, how do we resource this in such a way that it doesn't become a burden for them? I mean, there's limitations on how far we can go, but we don't want people showing up once we're ready to give back whole genome sequencing information and be running into a doctor, you know, who is just not prepared to even deal with this. And as a side note, one of our biggest challenges to get going on the genetics piece is testing our return of results to multiple communities and understanding how it's working. But how do we develop the right telegenetic, or either telegenetic or in-person genetic counseling capacity? There's a shortage of this capacity around the country already. Even our health provider organization members who are doing the cutting-edge precision medicine for clinical care are like, we don't have enough genetic counseling for our own patients, let alone what may come through here. So this is one of the conundrums of, okay, how are we going to build that out in an affordable and scalable way so that we can do the genetic counseling support? So I have seen articles and blogs written about us, it's like, oh, they're just going to give all this data away. It's like, first of all, our IRB would not let us, I'm sure. But it's
not what we want to do. We want to do the responsible return of information, and this is one of the areas that we will learn about and publish about as we try, iterate, and get better at doing this over a period of time. So the basic version of the protocol, you can go to allofus.nih.gov and learn about the version 1 protocol. I think we're probably at like 1.7, so you guys are probably evaluating 1.7. But these are tweaks to a fundamental protocol that's pretty much the same. And what we imagine is every 2.5 to 3.5 years, depending on the scientific questions we're trying to aim this to help, and the funding that we get from Congress and or from the outside, then there would be a major new release, some of which is continuous, based on the first version of the protocol. But for example, we're not doing hair or fingernails in this first version of the protocol, which many environmental researchers are like, when are you going to do that? But you can't afford to do everything at once. And some of this is going to take a while to figure out how do you, again, scale it up just to do the collection, but most importantly, how do you get ready to give that information back? There's so many cohorts that there are other million-person cohorts, and every single one of them, when we go talk to them, and we're learning from them, it's like, yeah, but we haven't promised to give any data back, and we have not promised to be diverse. And these are two of the things that we're going to learn how to do at scale that will hopefully help the whole research community move forward. So the basic protocol right now, we're recruiting 18 and above. We have a children's working group that have produced a report that's public on the allofus.nih.gov website. And now internally, the consortium has brought its expertise on children to figure out how to operationalize that report. So we're not going to be ready for national launch for it, but we're aiming to try to say, okay, how do we scale this up? And we want it to do people of all ages. Because again, you want multiple diverse people at different life stages, and then unpacking and sort of seeing what happens over time. I mentioned before you do consent, either e-consent or paper, and then this includes sharing your EHR data. There are 3 initial survey modules, or what we call PPI, Participant Provided Information Survey modules, just some basics about their overall health and their lifestyle. And there's a lot of others being worked on that we won't wait for a V2 for, but that will roll out. In part, engagement, like, how do we engage in one of the areas that many of our communities have talked about they want to learn more about is cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. So how do we leverage, for example, National Alzheimer's Month with the release of our instruments that are going to be focused on those issues and really turn that into both an education and a recruitment campaign around what's the state of the art in Alzheimer's, but also what's going on in research in that area. Physical measurements, it's not a physical, you don't take your clothes off, but still some folks come to me and they'll be like, okay, so when I go in for my physical, it's like, no, it's some physical measurements. You're doing blood pressure, BMI, heart rate, height, hip circumference, waist circumference, and weight. And then the initial biosamples, as I've mentioned, are blood and urine. And I've learned what an aliquot is, but amongst this crowd, I'm not even going to start talking about it with you because you have much more expertise than I do in there. So that's the basics of it. I mentioned that we're in this closed beta phase. By closed, I mean, if you go to joinallofus.org, and I hope you will, if you're interested in it, you can actually sign up for just newsletters and information about it. You'll get to a point where you need a code to put it in. Only our health provider, community partner, and direct volunteers have those codes to give out because we're trying to control the number of people initially to make sure everything's working end to end. But very, very soon, you will see lots of press about this. It will be open to the country. That code will no longer be required, and people can actually sign up for it and join it. So that's kind of where we are. I'm happy to say we initially thought we'd do 10 to 15,000. I mentioned there's over 25,000 participants somewhere in the process, and we crossed the line of 16,000 participants who have finished the entire version 1 of the protocol. We're increasingly getting surveys and other information back from them on everything from the website to the language and trying to get to a point where we can make continuous improvement. We are not doing a good job of that yet. We are not terribly nimble as an organization, having figured out, you've gotten a bunch of feedback from people, how do you act upon it quickly? Because it's pretty complicated with the software that's being developed, getting new content tested, sent to the IRB, translated into Spanish, but over time, I hope we can be a lot more responsive to the needs that are coming in from our communities. And then, I think, where am I on time, Dajan? I should probably skip this section. All right. I'll summarize this section of saying, look, over time, as you start to see cohorts, they've been small, large, they're getting larger, but a lot of them are data silos and they don't share amongst themselves. And what we're trying to ultimately get to is, how do we get to the point where it's a learning health system and all 327 million of us have the option, not the requirement, to share our data with research in an ongoing way, So that the turn between scientific discovery and outcomes can be much tighter. One of the ways to think about our program is we're having to think about programs at scale, and this is kind of what me and others who are hiring from Silicon Valley can bring is, okay, what are the scale problems? What are these new policy issues? What are the ethical issues as you're trying to extend the research capacity to much larger than we have today? And how do you do some practical things like EHR data from multiple different places be able to be comparable for research purposes in a way it was never designed for, right? So, we won't solve all these problems, we're not the only one, but that was part of our 8th or 7th or however many it was values, where it's like, let's be on the forefront of trying new things so that we can help share both the failures and the successes with the research community to move that forward. So that's what that section was about. I eventually showed the global learning health system. Let me just end with this section on ethical challenges. There's 4 for an LC portfolio for you, that most of this room knows what that is, but ethics, legal, and social implications of our research. These are 4 focus areas for our programs with some examples of these 4 focus areas. The policy implications of this. I mean, we're running into all kinds of things, not the least of which are 50 different states having not 50, but 30 or 15 different approaches to EHR consent, to genomics, to you name it. And it is a nightmare to sort of, go through that and try to be legally and regulatory compliant, but at the same time deliver a great quality experience for your participants who are coming in from different states or may move to different states over time. So how do we evaluate those, right? The things that we're trying to do for privacy protections. Citizen science governance is a huge one. We want citizen scientists to ultimately be able to move up the access tiers to data that may be higher risk for re-identification, but how do you hold them accountable the same way that you do a university? You're going to ask them to sign up for an EAR Commons account? That sounds painful, right? So we're serious about citizen science, but this is an area where we need help with both the policies and the practicalities of how do you actually, hold them accountable if they start to be bad actors with data. The second is really the value to stakeholders. So research that's going to really help us gauge the attitudes and the impacts on stakeholder groups regarding the problems, right? I mean, I just talked about participant preferences and the return of results or the return of information. Digital versus in person, because some of our folks are going to be very digitally savvy and others won't. We ultimately need to embrace the digital approach, but it doesn't, we want to figure out ways to teach people that, but some people in our cohort are never going to be digitally savvy, so what are the ethical and appropriate roles for us to figure out how can those folks have helpers and what's the role that helpers can play, and is that regulatory covered in different states in different ways? You can see some of the challenges in the research that will need to be there. Finally, third, in research practice, how do we appraise the effects of these decisions that we're making? I just said to Dr. Collins, the head of NIH, it's like we need some ethnographers just studying everything that we're doing, just independent, watching everything that we're doing. Because people will tell us, do you realize this is going to be an important study for 100 years? I'm like, no, don't say that yet. We're just trying to get out the door. But if we do this right, I think this will have impact for a long time. But most importantly, we're making decisions every single day. And it's like, we're making some good decisions, we're making some bad decisions, but let's go back and understand the challenges that we overcame or didn't overcome as we were going through. But also, how do you do scalable engagement with underrepresented biomedical research communities? When we set out to try to even just define what underrepresented biomedical research is, there's very little literature and it's an incredible conflict, and it took us 9 months. What we thought was going to be a 3-week exercise to go just say, hey, go take best practices on engaging UBR communities. It's like it doesn't exist for the most part. Or if it exists, the studies are so small scale that it's like, that's great that you were able to do that for 10 people. So I need to do this for 100,000 people who fit that particular demographic background. What's the method that we use to be able to do that? And then lastly, supporting convenings around, leveraging our funds to encourage the increased current or instigation of new, groups of people coming together on these issues. I'd love somebody to say, hey, fund a workshop that looks at, to the degree that there are any best practices on how to, empower citizen scientists, but also hold them accountable for good behavior, like you're holding your academic researchers for, as an example. So I'll just end with a couple of thoughts. This is a challenge. How do you establish and sustain trust in the shadow of Tuskegee and all of its ilk? And that is the best word to describe it, right? This is an enormous challenge. Our strategy is to address these issues head-on with communities. leverage the local community partners who are teaching us about ways to approach this, and do user-centered design with these participants to say, okay, what would need to be in place to actually help, sort of deal with those challenges. I mean, and it's really hard. I mean, we had folks in some of the tribes that we met with this week who were like, if somebody self-identifies that they're part of our tribe, we want you to give us their name and phone number, and we need to validate that they're part of our tribe, right? It's like, oh my God, we can't do that. That breaks the fundamental commitment to protecting people's identity. But at the same time, they have unbelievably legitimate concerns for a bunch of people signing up and research being done about their tribe that may or may not be of that tribe, right? So these are tough areas to actually deal with, but given the harm that the federal government and others have done in the name of research, how do we overcome that? At the same time, how do we explain the consequences of if they're excluded from the research, but without overpromising? I mean, we all, most of the people in this room know that it's going to take years of data collection and years of science before the hope of saying something that's going to help this particular participant in the study may come forward that we can share information with them. At the same time, if their communities are left behind, we have some fun, we are not doing the science and thus having a chance to do the cures or the prevention strategies that are precise and targeted for the lifestyle, for the culture, for the economic reality, for the health reality that they have lived in. So this is one of our challenges. But as you think about these, I'll just leave you with these last 2 pages and we'll share these slides. And we welcome your input on our LC portfolio. We don't have a call for proposals out there. If NIH has any LC call for proposals out there, you can apply to it, mark it as saying this is for the All of Us research program, and they'll bring them to us to see if we can fund it. We don't normally fund the research, because as I said before, but in these early days, we need to fund grants and rewards that help us figure these things out. And that's the way that we've set this up. We didn't want to wait until we can get a whole RFI and call for proposals. So our LC colleagues have said, just get people to flag it, focus in on the All of Us research program, they'll send to us and we'll evaluate and see what we can fund. So these are some of the areas. What's the line between helpful targeted messaging and outreach? We're going to talk about this with Nancy at lunch probably momentarily, and coercion. Right? We've got these analytic capabilities on the web and elsewhere. We want to make messages that are relevant to people, but at what point have we crossed a line and basically given them no choice, like some of the marketing firms and some of the product companies do, right? Where you've really got to question, like, given that constant hammering of people over time and pushing those psychological buttons, like, this does not feel appropriate anymore. How can we make sure that participants understand the intrinsic and extrinsic value of being in the program while managing their expectations and not overpromising? Yes, you will, by definition, get a whole genome sequence and can have that data back at some point, but no, it's not going to immediately cure you. In fact, it'll probably be pretty boring for most of you this day and time, because a very small percentage, but over time, the value of that to you and to the research program will likely grow. How do we strike the balance between meaningful participant informativeness and user-friendliness and time burden? It's back to that, we want them to understand what's in EHR, but if that's an hour-long excursion, there's a staff member sitting there going, I've got 5 more participants in that I need to get through, and this person's still digging around on the web around EHR consent. How do we responsibly return information on a big scale, right? And there's multiple pieces of that. Here's some more. There's so many PhDs and master's theses that can be wrote around this. I'm just saying. All of Us is a research program. It's not a provider of care, but can and how should we assist with access to care, right? If a person with no doctor and they've got a variation of known significance that's pathogenic, but there's no doctor for us to hand that off to and do counseling with, we can't become their care provider, but I think our responsibility is to do the best that we can with our community partners in those areas to help at least show them the options for care that they could have, right? But how to protect vulnerable populations from stigmatizing research with a program that will scale to thousands of proposed research studies on top of it if we're successful. Should we adopt some kind of benefit sharing model, right? So profits from the research learnings are shared with participants. Who has done this, should say well, not weak, who has done this well? Has anybody done it remotely at this scale? We're not starting out that way. It doesn't mean we couldn't convert to something like that. It terrifies me because, as we all know, the distance between a discovery at a university grant turned into a massive company, there's a whole lot of other invention and IP in that, so I come from that world. but at the same time, it does feel like people ought to have the chance. But then how are you going to manage expectations? Because you would imagine you start to say, I'm going to become a millionaire over this. It's like, no, you're not, right? So that's a whole bunch of issues in and of itself. You know, de-identification is imperfect. We're doing everything we can with the latest technologies to de-identify people. It gets more complicated as you have other laminations of data that get added over time. And even it's something that's in our innocuous first tier bucket of data that's low risk to no risk of re-identification, but once you add this data type over here, it's like, oh, we might have to move that to tier 2 or even to tier 3, right? So how do we do that? And then how can we include vulnerable populations, such as children, the cognitively impaired? We have work groups working on that, but again, we're desperate for best practices, even if they're at small scale, so that we can at least start with something that's worked somewhere else and then build on top of that as we go forward. So I'll end on that. If you have ideas, Kate Lazinski at AIH is putting together our strategy and working with those other institutes and centers on our LC portfolio, and you can send ideas to her. I did not get her okay to put her email on here, but I'm going to let her know just as soon as I get out of here. So I'll stop there and happily take any comments or questions that you have for however long we can. Thanks for the opportunity to share this with you.
We can do questions for 10 plus minutes. Floor's open.
Okay.
Thanks so much. That was a great talk. Yeah, I got one. Good. I have a whole bunch of questions I'm going to ask too.
Okay.
One, I don't know how much contact you have with the feedback that you're getting, that you're not nimble enough yet to respond to, but if you have any kind of granular contact with that, what has been the most sort of challenging or useful feedback you've gotten from the 16,000 participants that have gotten all the way through?
Yep.
And then the second question is more long-term, probably don't have an answer for it yet, but we're really bad at getting what we learned from biomedical research
Back to
care.
yes. Yep.
Has the program started thinking about what that will look like? What's coming out of this program? You're going to have such national reach.
Yep.
I mean, the possibility that you could improve translation into care is absolutely there, but is that something that's part of your planning?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that we want to do. I'll answer the second part first. I mean, we're partnering with the CTSA or NCATS and others thinking about that. And I mean, part of my own background and things that I learned at Intel that we worked on there about how do you translate to practice, there are methods and approaches that I think we can bring from industry that will continue to improve that. But I'd be lying to you if I said we had a remote plan for it. I mean, you know, right now we're like, okay, let's just do no harm and start collecting the data and sharing it back with people. And yes, there's a million other things that we need to do, but I mean, truth be told, I wish this program had not had it's great that it had the visibility it did from the prior administration, but it also created expectations that are very painful to have inherited. And you know, we've got people yelling at us because we don't have children yet. We've got people yelling at us because we haven't started whole genome sequencing yet. And I had to remind people that it's like, we would wipe out all of the capacity that exists in the United States for whole genome sequencing times 4 more needed, right? It's like, it is going to take a while to get the return of results and just the basic capacity in place to deal with what we've got with. And so we have had conversations and thoughts and even brainstorm with NCATS about the kind of translation research they might fund on top of our program. But you know, we got to get further down the path before we get to it. In the first wave of feedback, and this is before we could even do surveys with folks, but we were getting frontline staff feedback. And I'm trying to do a regular call now with the frontline staff. So even with the surveys coming in, I find nothing more valuable than convening the frontline staff who are on the, in the trenches of this, like regularly to get feedback. We had a great one last week, and I invited them all to send me their email list, and I'm trying to respond to everyone, but it's like, it's crazy. One of the first areas that was clearly very confusing was around EHRs. We needed more explanation of what might be in the EHR, what are the risks for EHR. We were sending mixed messages with different parts of our website around, you know, is EHR required or not. So we have a version that's just coming imminently. We call the surge version. We're going to do some surge testing before we go national. And we're continuing to improve that, and we've developed animations and other kinds of things that help people understand. So that was one of them. In some ways that was, I mean, I think we would have had that anyway, but we didn't make it easy because we we were not communicating well about, about that. And I think we were still figuring it out as we went along as well. Another has just been, I mean, even as we push through, particularly the FQHCs, but not only the FQHCs, they're like, we just need more collateral on, our participants need more collateral on just understanding what research is and what kinds of things might come out of this. It's sort of in the expectations management category. There was a whole lot of feedback just about the user interface and the design of the researcher portal, and that's kind of an ongoing continuous loop. And then the other, I mean, we do get a lot of questions from people about when is the genomics happening, what does that really mean? We've worked so hard to try to get people to divorce that precision medicine equals genomics and that the all of us research group equals genomics. Of course, that's made the genomics community mad. It's like, we're not serious. It's like, we are serious, build capacity and we'll do it. But at the same time, for some people, and we knew this from surveys we had done before we even launched, that's one of the big value propositions for people to be in it. And I just was part of the great discussion with the students here today. I actually walked them through a survey of like, do you want this information about yourself? And this is a pretty heady, savvy group, right? Now go do that in the community of vulnerable populations at an FQHC on the border in San Diego, where we have San Ysidro, and in the current immigration climate, right? Yeah, good luck with that, right? So it's things like that, and they definitely want to understand the privacy chain. So we're trying to figure out how do we take certificates of confidentiality and explain that concept in a way that people can all do it without being an attorney. So those have been some of the things, but there's a lot more. Here.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I was struck by your beginning anecdote about sort of the value of entrepreneurialism as a patient with an acute medical condition, and it made me wonder about a different ethics question in this last, not on this last slide, which is, it strikes me that depending on how the findings from all of us are used, you could end up with interventions that are identified through doing research on disadvantaged populations, but are only of benefit to you if you're interested in taking a certain kind of approach to your own medical care. And when I heard the first anecdote, I wondered whether it really was, I could see the attraction of that for some folks, but I wondered whether it was the proper way to think about what we should expect of people in medical care to all take that perspective. And that made me think about a sort of justice question presented by involving populations of this research and then thinking about the potential uses.
I mean, you're getting at an issue that, as a social scientist, like if I could go back and do real work, it's not that I don't do real work, but it's like a different kind of real work. I mean, I'm lost without doing field work, and I'm just somehow imagining that somehow I could do some, but I've been talking to social science communities. I mean, there are these kind of patient activation segmentations and scores that are out there, but most of what is out there I find really poor compared to the experience of trying to train people with cancer to have their different response. So what I really feel like we need is an understanding of the range of patient response to illness that's pretty deep and rich now in kind of segmentation. And then some different strategies of where you think you could take people to, and what are the different and effective educational strategies, because it won't be one size fits all like anything else. But it's all anecdotal for me. I keep a journal and I go back and I'm like, okay, there's not an infinite number of strategies I've used to help patients that request help from me. There's probably 5 or 6, but I would love us to start to understand that where is somebody when they get a major complicated illness or something, and what are ways that you could take them that would be to their benefit, and what are the strategies to do that. That's one of those side things where I'm like, I want to figure out somebody to go actually do that research. But I don't assume that everybody, though I have to say, I find that adult children of seniors who are frail have been hopelessly bad at estimating what they think their parents can and can't and will and won't do, and be trained as a patient themselves, even with early stage cognitive decline. And I often find that a lot of us will sort of make assertions about you'll never be able to train that group on how to do what, And I'm just like, show me that you tried and failed, and then I will believe you. But I think we infantilize a lot of people and don't give them enough credit for saying, if you're patient with them, if you have good training, and you show them the value proposition of doing this, then a lot more people can learn these things than you actually think. I've done this probably 100 times over with very frail senior groups in 38 countries, and it's like, you know, their children and their doctors and everybody else are saying they'll never be able to do this. And I'm like, stop infantilizing them and try it first.
One more quick question?
I'm wondering if you're going to be able to collect information of biologically related families, or if your privacy principles are going to make that impossible, so that you can't.
I mean, one of the strategies that many in the children field have been like, hey, you should do intact families. And that was, we discussed it back in the working group sessions and said, okay, we're not going to start out doing that. But, you know, there may be ways that we want from, and as we figure out our strategy for children where that actually may make particular sense. And it's, you know, there's two things that as I've come in, everybody's like, Eric, you can't let this happen. First of all, you've got to fix all the failures with the National Children's Study. And I'm like, hey, I've learned what that is, but I wasn't here, didn't do it. And, you know, we have talked to them and learned from them what some of their challenges were. And one of them was focus, right? It's like, we cannot be all things to all people with this. And we're about to do a research workshop March 20th through 21st, where we're getting people to submit use cases of saying, imagine this cohort is yours to advance the science in the area that you care about most. What kinds of research questions would you have? What kinds of studies would answer those questions? What kind of data would you need to do that, and how would you need to collect that data? And then what we're going to be looking for is commonalities that can have multi-field impact. And outside of that, people will apply to do an ancillary study with a smaller number of people in our particular group. One of the reasons that we're actually doing that is because we need to figure out what are we going to aim the science at over time. And it's, you know, every release will probably have some things that are going to be good for a lot of scientific areas. But I'm hoping that by the time we get to V2, we might say, hey, to our participants and everybody else, this is focusing on some of your concerns about cognitive decline. And this release is going to really help move the field of disparities in mental health forward, so that hopefully people can get excited and realize, because if we try to tackle everything all at once, I think we'll fail and we'll be at some of the risks that the children's study has. And so we're like, look, you know, we'll pilot and try some of those approaches, but we want to do it carefully and make sure that that scientific approach is going to answer a wide range of questions.
I'm afraid we need to bring this to an end. Eric, thank you so much. It was terrific.
Thank you.